We live, sadly, in a time of extremism. You find extreme left, extreme right. The good news is that in most instances, much of the political extremism in this country is not violent. I'm not saying entirely not, and that potentially can be troublesome, but we can call it, I want to call it peaceful, but it's not to the extent where we have to be worried about true violence in most cases. Unfortunately, in the world, we find other types of extremism, religious extremism, that is very much connected to terrorism and violence. But the bottom line is extremism of any sort, and just qualifying just the different variations and the extent of it, is always dangerous. I remember once speaking for a group of individuals, and the demographic was actually some people from the far left, some from the far right, and some people moderates, center, center right, center left. It was a conversation about politics. President Trump was then president, so you could imagine the lightning rod of different opinions. So before I began, I asked who consider themselves extreme left or far left. Quite a few people raised their hand. Anybody considers themselves far right, extreme right? Another group of people raised their hands. It was pretty much even, actually. And I said, I want to thank both of you. They looked at me, how could you thank both of us? I said, because if you want to know where the middle of the road is, you need to know where the extremes are. You need to know where the boundaries are. And it's the extremes that teach us where the middle is. So we got a nice laugh. But the point I wanted to make was, words from Maimonides, a very powerful line. He said, one should always choose the middle path. Not extreme right, not extreme left. He does qualify and say that at times, if a person has wandered off and went too far to one extreme, they sometimes have to go to the other extreme to even it out. It's just like when you veer off the road and you go too far to the right, you're going to have to go much more to the extreme left to get back to the center. But from a point of view of politics or point of view of perspectives and opinions, that's not always necessarily the case. The point is that it's always best to be in the middle. And middle does not mean what we call in Hebrew or Yiddish parav, neutral. You're not here and not there, which means like the undecided, like the guy, a pollster came to someone to do a survey, and he said, so yes or no? He says, I think I'm in the undecided group. I'm in the undecided group. So I'm not talking about an undecided, someone that's apathetic or indifferent, but simply understanding the nuances of life, the gray areas of life, is the key thing to always remember. That there may be virtue to one extreme, there may be virtue to the other, but a full picture that's usually extremist is not healthy. Now, of course, in extreme situations, you may need an extreme position, just like when we talk about World War II. In the beginning, they tried to appease Hitler, and then it became very clear that appeasement is, as Churchill said, appeasement is feeding the crocodiles in the hope you'll be eaten last. And then you do need to take a strong position. So this is a very fascinating subject, which has real implications in life, especially today with the polarization of such extreme opinions, of how do you deal with extremism? How do you deal with zealotry? How do you deal with radicalism? And is there any room for it? And what's the context? Because sometimes people will say, one second, I have a very strong opinion. I'm very much for something or against something. Why can I not be forceful about it? And again, we're all agreeing that we need it to be peaceful. That's not even a question. But at times, frankly, especially when there's danger, go back to World War II, it wasn't just peaceful. You had to go to war. It was a matter of life and death. So it does spill over. When I said peaceful, I meant to say in the conversation that's more political issues or issues that are open to conversation. But there are times where zealotry is required simply because you're dealing with a true enemy, and you don't say to yourself, let's sit down for negotiation if a guy's coming with a gun into your home or into your community. But how do you address these issues? We all know the risks of extremism and radicalism, and we've seen it. Radical religion, extremist religion, extreme non-religion. Whenever there's extreme, it can go to a point where people become so adamant that they don't tolerate anybody else. And we've seen in history the damage that's done to it. On the other hand, is there room in our value system for a time where there is a need for an extreme behavior? So we have a character in the Bible, and we go back to the best-selling book of all time, the Bible itself. We have a character that when you study his personality, you get the answers to these questions. But before I even get to that character, I want to just broaden the question. This is also addresses not just politics, not just times of war, of life and death, but even how we interact in our marriages, in our relationships, with friends. What happens if you have two people who really care about each other and like each other have very different opinions about something? Do you have to swallow your opinion? Do you have to compromise? Do you have to be silent? Or can you have a strong opinion while also maintain a relationship with another? Unfortunately, we see a personalization that's going on, that literally what we call character assassination, that if I disagree with you, I have to also dismiss you as a person. And I say, I don't believe in that, and therefore I never do that. But you see that concept. You see people who don't just dismiss an opinion, they dismiss the person who has the opinion as well. And demonizing, or what people call today blacklisting, or the different terms used for it that exist today. We spoke about this as well in other episodes. So what we're discussing here has implications in every aspect of our lives. So who's the character? The character is Pinchas. In the book of Numbers, there's a chapter called Pinchas. He was an individual, and the Bible describes who he was and who his parents were and his ancestors. And he behaved an act of zealous act, he behaved like a zealot, where he saw the desecration of God by one of the leaders of the Jewish tribes. His name was Zimri. And he desecrated with a woman an illicit relationship in public, considered to be one of the most biggest desecrations one can do, behaving in such a fashion. And we're talking about a leader. So the Bible tells us that he went ahead, unceremoniously, speared him and the woman, and killed them in public in this act of zealotry. Now, there was no due process, which itself is a question. And what we find is that he's actually rewarded. He's rewarded with what? Of all things, the covenant of peace. Covenant of peace? You can say, even if it was warranted, fine, reward him for subduing the mutiny that Zimri was leading against God, against Moses, and so on. But the covenant of peace? How is peace a reward for an act of zealotry? Even if it's condoned to some extent. But more importantly, how is someone able to act as a zealot altogether? And yet this is documented in the Bible, but you find at the same time this does not mean that anybody can just go ahead and do this. This is not a precedent where anybody can say, hey, I see a crime happening, and I will do whatever it takes to punish the people who are doing the crime. There is a thing called due process. You can come and testify in court, bring evidence, bring witnesses, but you don't just take the law in your own hands. That's called a lynch mob. And you don't find anywhere in the Bible, in the Torah, anywhere, even a semblance of saying we learn from Pinchas that you can do that. So what's the story here? What's going on? So let's go back to the appeasement. The appeasement. If you appease someone who should not be appeased, you are actually then doing something that's the opposite of peace. In other words, if it's required to do something, to act, and you don't act, that can be the crime. There's an expression by some of the Hebrew sages that say the following, that someone who's kind to the cruel will ultimately be cruel to the kind. Someone who is who is compassionate to the wicked will ultimately be wicked to the compassionate. Everyone can understand this example. If you see your family being threatened, directly threatened, we all know what happened in Texas, where the hundreds of officers just waited an hour, hour and a half, and innocent people died. So if you see your children, you see your family, you see your community being attacked, and you say, 1 second, let's talk about it, let's negotiate, let's find what's the grievances, maybe the terrorist, the attacker needs therapy, let's send them flowers. We all understand that that's completely ridiculous. Not just ridiculous, that's criminal. And you have to act immediately because there's a direct danger. If there's a direct danger and it's a situation that can be diffused and afterwards you deal with it in a court of law is one thing. But if a man's standing with a gun and is shooting and has shot people, it changes the whole equation. Pinchas saw that. So that's number one. The second thing is, interesting, is Pinchas was a man of peace. He was not known to be a zealot. There were people who were, Shimon, Levi, there were others in the Bible that were warriors. They were known to be warriors. Here was a man that everyone knew was the most docile and peaceful person. So when you see that he rises to defend the desecration, and literally this was a crime that was causing death. It says a plague broke out because of this desecration. It was causing death, so he saved lives. But it's coming, and this is the key, not from a zealot, but from a peaceful person. That changes everything, because then you know it's an act coming from humility, not from aggression. And this is an important psychological lesson in life. There are people who, whenever someone needs to be punished or someone needs to be reprimanded, they're always first online. Here I am. You don't see them being first online to reward someone, to give someone a compliment. Now, sometimes the situation actually warrants reprimanding, warrants some type of rebuke, or even punishment. But why are you always online when it comes to that? So the concept is this, that what you're doing is you're dressing up your aggression, so-called, in legal terms. You're still an aggressor, and you would be cruel to people in general. Here you found a legitimate way to be cruel. And that's why it's so critical that when a person exerts that type of what's called in Hebrew by the mystics and the Hasidic masters, gvura, aggression, you have to double check. Even though, as I said before, compassion and kindness in the wrong place could also be destructive, like water. Water is necessary for nourishment, for sustenance. Yet too much water is flooding. Too much kindness can also cause damage. But the damage that's done by fire, which is gvura, which is judgment, severity, can be worse. So though it always has to be moderate, whether it's not to spoil someone with kindness, and definitely not to be kind to the cruel, only in order to help them grow, which I'll talk about shortly, and definitely not to be cruel to the kind, which is really cruelty. And just as you're manifesting, you're finding a sinister situation where you say, you know what, here it's legitimate. So you have to check, what's your motivation? Are you really looking for the truth? Or are you looking to express your anger, your aggression, your violence, your intense personality? So the lesson that we learn from this is that there are times where you may need a zealot act. You may need it. But firstly, there has to be a condition where there are people really at risk of their life, and you're talking about a dangerous situation. And secondly, that it's coming from someone that is a humble person in the first place. Because if it's coming from a person who's an aggressive person, then you have to question what is the motive. Now, of course, there's a scenario, one second, if a person is an aggressive person happens to be in a situation where he sees that innocent people are being hurt, what are we going to say? That since he's aggressive, he shouldn't do it? So obviously we understand there's that qualification. But the main lesson that the Bible wants to tell us is that zealotry, like every behavior, especially if it's extreme, needs even more humility than anything else. We spoke about this in somewhat a different context last week. We talked about David being both a warrior and a psalmist. He wasn't a warrior by nature. He was a psalmist. He was a gentle shepherd. But when it was necessary, it was necessary. And the same thing with Pinchas. So the two lessons we learn is not to be passive in a time when we need something aggressive, but to check the aggression and make sure it's not coming from any of your personality, but it's coming from the humble seeking for what is right and what is true. And that's why he was rewarded the covenant of peace, because he brought peace to the world. He brought peace by eliminating the danger that was causing death to people, but he brought peace because he came from a peaceful place. And that's the interesting thing. So in a situation where you appease when you shouldn't be appeasing, when you're being compassionate to the cruel, and in effect, you are actually empowering them. What happened after Chamberlain came back, waving the paper as he was going down the tarmac? He was going down from the plane. He was saying, "Peace in our times." As he was walking down the steps from the airplane, Hitler was already in the Sudetenland and taking over Czechoslovakia and a little later Poland. That's what we were dealing with. Now, obviously, you try initially, but if you see quickly who we're dealing with, then no, a peaceful approach is not going to work. It's actually going to cause more war because you're feeding the crocodile. Exactly right, exactly as Churchill said. There are situations which should be qualified where you may need to see a situation where it may deem necessary to have something more aggressive, a discipline, and yet you have to check it with your humility, and perhaps first you do an overture, a peaceful overture, to see if you can stop the situation. I'm not talking about if someone's actually shooting. Then you'd have to do what has to be done to stop the killing. But in case of a situation where somebody behaved in a very inappropriate way, and there's no immediate danger, so yes, there may be a possibility of trying out some way to communicate. Doesn't necessarily have to be through aggression, but you have to always be wary that you're dealing with someone who may be manipulative and someone who may just take advantage of your kindness. So that needs to be qualified. But overall, once there is that aggression, and once you know that's the only way to work is zealotry, you must have that humility. Because without it, we risk the danger of anarchy. We risk the danger of people taking the law in their own hands and doing the worst possible things. How does this apply to our personal lives? Many of us may or may never be faced, hopefully, with situations that are extreme, like I described, a shooting where you really need to defend them. Hopefully you never have to face a Hitler again, or anyone in that position. But in our own lives, there are people that can be quite destructive with words, with behavior, abusive, of different forms. How do you deal with that? So to tolerate abuse is actually feeding abuse. It's feeding the crocodile. If any abuse is coming your way, or you see it coming the way of another innocent person, yes, wherever possible, you need to intervene. Now, that's not so simple as well, because that doesn't mean you can go around, because you have to first establish it's actually abuse. You have to establish and know the situation. You have to also establish if you can be of any help. But just to be quiet when you see someone innocent being hurt, no, that's not peaceful to just say, I'll be passive. We have too many of that around psychologically where people just stand bystander. It's not my problem, it's someone else's problem. And people have been hurt in the process. So number one is that we have to care. Number two, you have to make sure that you're not coming with any aggression of your own. That you're coming with humility. And when you do that, it's much more likely that you'll get through to the person. Not saying it's guaranteed, but even when you need to do discipline and there's something that needs to be strong, at least it's coming from a pure place. Now, how do we apply that in our personal lives? Disagreements between spouses, between parents and children, between friends, between co-workers, which really applies to the polarization of our times. People with very strong positions. When Roe versus v. Wade was overturned, look at the volatility that it I wouldn't say created, that emerged from it. How do you communicate about things that are very different? People have very extreme different opinions. So the lesson from Pinchas is very clear: humility. You must be humble. Even in your strong opinion, you need to be humble. Now, whether the other person will notice or not is not relevant here. Hopefully they will, but you need to be that way. Don't get caught up in your own argument, meaning that you must win the argument. You may be right, and you may be justified, but the humility that we learn from Pinchas, that even a disagreement has to be peaceful. That even when the two sages would disagree in the Talmud, and they disagreed adamantly and vehemently, it was never personal, because it was not about me or you. It was about what is right. I'm looking for the truth. And indeed, if you have the truth, I'm ready to acknowledge it. I'm ready to say I was wrong, acknowledge I was wrong, and change my position. I know that's rare today, but that's what we learned from Pinchas, because he wasn't coming from an aggression. Even if he had aggressive behavior in that situation, he was not an aggressive person. And the same thing in when we discuss things. I would even say, going back to that big word called insecurity, very often insecurity lies at the heart of many disagreements. What I mean by that is, you need to be wrong for me to be right means I'm insecure. Why? I could have a position and you can have a position. If I'm confident in my position and secure in it, so there's another way to look at it. And maybe I can learn from you or you can learn from me. The fact that people dig in often, as the guy that said to me once, he said about a certain individual I had to meet, he says, remember, he hides his ignorance with his arrogance. Very often we hide our insecurities with our aggression. So the aggression is not, he may not even be an aggressive person. So I'm talking now a new scenario. There's an aggressive person that hides behind legitimizing his aggression. That this is right, and then that person deserves judgment and punishment. But then there are people who actually are not even really aggressive people. They just put on an act because they're trying to protect themselves. Maybe they were hurt. Maybe they were criticized. So those who criticize become the biggest critics. But this is where we all learn from Pinchas. Look at yourself first. Before you get into a discussion, into a disagreement, before you even have a position, is it coming from the sincere seeking truth, seeking what is right? Or are you getting involved? Is it about you being right or wrong, about your position? And that's the key to separate between you and your perspectives. That doesn't mean you're not entitled to, doesn't mean you shouldn't have strong perspectives. So the lesson of Pinchas, even though ostensibly it seems like the story of a zealot and his reward, the covenant of peace, is a tremendous lesson in our lives today. May we only have disagreements that lead to greater truths and more clarity. I can tell you that I learn most from the people that disagree with me. The people sometimes in our office, we have an idea comes up, and I always say, let's stretch the idea. Let's even argue against it, even if it's an idea I came up with, because that's how you get that crystallization and the clarity of something, because you say you tested it and stretched it in every direction. Always be the devil's advocate. And then you come away with a better conclusion. Don't be afraid of another opinion. Because if you're looking for truth, other opinions can only help clarify. Because if it is indeed true, your position, then the other opinion will either acknowledge it at some point on the merit of the arguments, not because who's going to win. And even better, that opinion may actually add a nuance, add a point that makes the position, the final position approach, much healthier, much stronger. Because you saw other sides and you considered them, and they will only strengthen the final approach and strategy that we employ. So much to be learned from this biblical character, Pinchas, and that paradox of the zealot, the peaceful zealot. This has been Simon Jacobson, Meaningful Life Center, meaningfullife.com. Please subscribe to our channel on YouTube and friend us on Facebook and all the other platforms that we display our programming. Please share with others. And I'd love to hear your feedback, your thoughts, your suggestions, and even your different opinions. And may it all come together in a beautiful rainbow, a beautiful tapestry that just enriches us all in what we call the harmony within diversity. Thank you so much. Be well. See you soon.